lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm doing a mid-month reading wrap-up for the month of July. So I believe I've read about 13 books in the first half of July and today I'm going to be talking about them. I'm going to be going in chronological order. That seems the most sensible one to make sure I hit everything. And the first book I'm going to be talking about is Get a Life Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is a contemporary romance and was so much fun. I'm sure if you are aware of contemporary romance at all on BookTube, you'll have heard of this book because it has been very, very much beloved, and there is a second book that has come out called Take a Hint, Danny Brown that has also been very, very well received, that only came out I think last month. So Get a Life Chloe Brown. Chloe Brown is our main woman protagonist, and basically she has a chronic illness, and because of this she's kind of had a little bit of a sheltered life for sort of the kind of her early past. However, when she's out and about she nearly gets involved in a car accident, and this is a wake-up call for her to be like, actually I need to start living my life. So she makes various changes, and in doing so meets our main man protagonist, which is Red. He is the superintendent in the building where she lives and is kind of going through a bit of a rough patch, and it is about the two of them kind of coming together and being able to help each other out. I really enjoyed this book on so many different levels. I think it was one of the sweetest contemporary romances I've read so far, and just adored it on like literally so many different levels. I loved Red, I loved his art, and I liked him as an artist and the way that he talked about art. I loved Chloe as a character. I thought she was so like bold and brave and really like intense and just fantastic. I also really enjoyed the representation of chronic illness and the way that it was both important to her story but not the thing that her story was hinging on. I can't speak to how well the representation was because obviously I don't have one myself, but I believe from what I've heard that it does quite a good job. It just generally was really sweet all round, and I really can't think of anything bad to say about it because it just really hit the spot perfectly for me. I thought pacing wise it was great, and it didn't do the really like the kind of conflict that happens once the couple is established didn't feel very trite and forced, and was resolved in kind of a meaningful way where both the characters could show their growth but had a moment of weakness, rather than it leaning on like a major misunderstanding, which honestly is, or miscommunication, which is honestly how a lot of these books go, that feels quite weak for me. So generally deeply enjoyed it, and definitely I'm going to be checking out Take a Hint, Danny Brown at some point soon. The next book I read is non-fiction, and that is Do No Harm by Henry Marsh. This is stories of life, death and brain surgery. As the subtitle suggests, Henry Marsh is a brain surgeon, and it is his memoir. This is him writing towards the end of his career, really looking back on his entire career, so it felt a little bit broad sweeping at times, and that sense of kind of removed from some of the action, so it didn't feel particularly emotional or personal in like places. However, I did think it was really enjoying looking at brain surgery and like the various bits of progress that they've made, how technology has informed how they do surgery, but also some of the difficulties with brain surgery, particularly for when things go wrong. It often doesn't result in death, but it often results in something happening to the person that impacts their quality of life and their way of life in some way, and just how do you deal with that as a surgeon. One thing that's worth noting is Henry Marsh is a slight almost like product of his time in some places. He has some deeply unflattering things to say about a whole collection of people, and there's just a few moments where it really sort of felt a little bit like, oh, that's kind of a douchebaggy thing to say, but you know, to give it some kind of context, he originally was supposed to be doing PPE at Oxford and then just decided to bounce for a year, and comes from a family of money, so there's just a kind of a different lifestyle that is being approached in this book, and I feel like it impacts the way that he writes about some people. But if you are interested in medical memoirs, the medical side of this is very strong, and there weren't any major moments where I was like, oh my god, you're a terrible human being. It was just like, oh, that's a little bit tone deaf and awkward, so just be aware of that going in. The next book I read is You Deserve Each Other by Sarah Hogle, and this is another contemporary romance, and this one just didn't work anywhere near as much for me. This one is about a couple who are about to be married, and they seem to kind of constantly be clashing, and it is basically the two of them trying to drive the other one to call off the wedding, because they kind of both have a lot on the line when it comes to like financial investment and various things into their wedding itself. The story, I was kind of, it was pitched that there was some sort of prenup involved, so that there was a little bit more on the line than literally just like personal pride, so I was a little bit, I didn't really buy into a lot of the beginning bit, and honestly one of the major issues with this was I just really didn't empathize or sympathize with our main woman lead. Like, I just really didn't like her, and I don't think that she particularly got stronger as the book went on or went through any kind of major character growth or character arc. She seemed really vapid and shallow, and the way that the two the kind of two in the romance were it was supposed to be almost like playful and play fighting and trying to drive each other away, but it kind of bordered on the edge of almost abusive in places, and I really just didn't enjoy what they were doing. It got better because they learned to fall back in love with each other and realised that maybe they didn't really know each other properly at the beginning, and I guess it was kind of doing a little bit of riffing off the commentary of like, how much do you really know your partner, and the importance of, in the early days of a romance when you're really trying to impress the person, not doing it to a point where you then don't represent yourself properly. But I just kind of felt like it all got a bit lost in the tangle, and there were just too many moments which was like, you guys are just being dicks to each other, and I'm not getting that warm cozy feeling that I was kind of hoping for. It does improve though as you go on, so if you're willing to stick with it, go for it, but I definitely don't think it's the best example of this genre. The next contemporary romance I read, I deeply enjoyed and was absolutely fantastic, and that is Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall. This is a gay romance between two men, clearly, and is a fake dating trope, and it is about our who is it? Oliver and I can't remember the other main guy's name, but basically we have the son of a rock star who is trying to make a kind of a name for himself, a life for himself away from his dad, and is trying to get a bit of a better reputation. He's been sort of rinsed in the tabloids recently, and he gets told by his boss in an entirely inappropriate way that they don't actually really ever deal with, that he needs to work on his image, and it'd be really helpful if he had like a lovely boyfriend to bring to their next kind of charity do benefit, to basically show off that he has his shit together. So he ends up making a deal with a friend of a friend that they're going to take it in turns to like pretend to be each other's boyfriend at very sort of big events that they have going on in their life, and then sort of hilarity ensues from there. Generally, I really enjoyed the relationship, and I really liked, again, it was sort of the pacing, I liked the scenes, none of it felt too like crazy outlandish being done just because it's a contemporary romance, and it would definitely never really happen like that in real life. Obviously the fake dating trope is a little bit unrealistic anyway, but it played it off the most realistic I think I've ever seen that trope be done, and I just generally really enjoyed all of it. I loved Oliver, I thought he was a wonderful character. I did love the other main guy. Seb, was his name Seb? I'm so bad with character names. But generally, I just really loved their dynamic and the friends in the background, and just the whole thing worked for me personally. So I would really recommend it. And I also think that the discussion of like the tabloids and what it's like to have your life kind of constantly splashed out for other people's sort of viewing and judgment, and the way that that can mess with how you trust people or interact with people, I thought was a really interesting discussion. The next book I finished is Heavy by Kiese Laymon. This is it's called actually an American memoir, but it is a memoir of a black man who lives in the south of America in the US, and it is just kind of a combination of his childhood and then going off to university. This was a deeply powerful book that I listened to on audiobook, and just was absolutely incredible in so many different ways, as well as obviously dealing with racism in his life. Kiese has a difficult relationship with his body, and he does suffer from an eating disorder and a very unhealthy relationship with exercise throughout his life, so it's generally a conversation around that. And one thing that was really fascinating about it as a reading experience is the physicality of the words and the constant presence of his body in like every interaction that he has, and his awareness of his own body and his own skin with every interaction that he has. It created an atmosphere that was just so intense and really visceral that as a reading experience it's just unlike anything I've really read before. Also, what I really enjoyed was it was really lyrical in places and dealt with a lot of kind of repeated like sentence structures and sentences, and again that in audiobook form where you could really hear the poetry of the words was absolutely phenomenal. I'm one who's always a little bit on the fence about memoirs as to whether I like definitely enjoy them or not, but this is probably one of my favourite memoirs I've ever read, and was just completely mind-blowing, especially so because I picked it up on a whim as like a 2-for-1 on Audible, so like amazing. I love it when books that you aren't really that fussed by as on your radar end up being just phenomenal reads. The next book I finished is Art on Fire by Hilary Sloin. This is a funky kind of fiction memoir thing. Basically it is a fictional account of a lesbian artist written as if it is a genuine biography of this artist, including a collection of kind of essays and articles written about her artwork, which clearly isn't real because it's all entirely fictional. including like fictional footnotes referencing fictional other pieces of art, like other pieces of writing about her artwork in it. In terms of as like a writing experiment and sort of playing around with format and how we understand fiction and non-fiction, I think that Hilary Sloin was doing so many unbelievably really cool and interesting things that I thought were just fascinating, and I'm slightly bummed out that I don't think she's written anything else and that nobody else has really gone for this, because it was just amazing in so many different ways. The actual storyline itself is basically our main character, who is this artist. It's about her childhood and her tensions with her younger sister, who is considered to be a child genius, and her older sister definitely gets ignored. She then runs away from home when her grandma finds her in bed with another girl, and it's about her trying to find her place in the world and her connections with the queer community, but then also her art getting discovered and how that impacts kind of her sense of self and the amount that people have read into her art. And then it kind of culminates in sort of a tension as she goes back home to see her parents and her sister for the funeral of her grandmother, in a way that it kind of becomes quite explosive towards the end. I'm happy to say that because you actually find that out at the very beginning, because this is written in the style of biography, there are a lot of events that happen that get referenced very, very early on and that you then see sort of being passed out slowly. It's doing a lot of interesting work in general, and I think it's also has a really cool discussion about like what the role of art is and kind of the purpose of it, and also the different ways that people can interpret it, that once it's sort of created, it definitely kind of leaves the artist sphere and it's just sort of out there for people to do what they want with. So generally I think it was doing just a lot of very cool different things, and I really loved it stylistically. The next book I read really was a massive letdown, and that is Claimed by Shadows by Lara Adrian. This was book 15? Am I up to 15 now? Believe book 15 in the Midnight Breed series, and it was probably one of the weakest I've read of the entire series. They're a whole paranormal romance thing with vampires and riffing off of an alien concept, but which I will do a full video on once I've finished the entire series. I have a book and a half left, one full book and one novella. But basically this was just the most like cut and paste rehashing of old storylines, both in terms of the romance but also the plot, just doing nothing interesting of the entire series. So not a great one, that one. The next book I have to talk about is The Future of Another Timeline by Annalee Newitz. This is a sci-fi book focused on time travel, and it is a world where time travel is really ingrained in our society completely, going back super historically. It's something that we can do on a geological level. It's linked to something to do with these particular rocks, and they can send people back in time in a way that it just is used in kind of every interface, every concept that we have. The actual storyline is about a group of kind of underground women's rights activists who are trying to go back to protect some progress that's been made, because there is an attack from sort of an alt-right, it's a select group particularly determined to destroy women's rights, who are going back to a particular moment in time to try and destroy certain progress, but then also to destroy the time machines to lock the timeline in place. Alongside that, there's kind of a thriller-esque thing going on that I won't talk too much about. There's almost like two different storylines going on, one running in a very linear timeline fashion and then one jumping around in the way that you would expect a time travel book to. Honestly, I didn't really like this book. Like, this has been very, very popular recently, been doing very, very well, and for me, I just don't think it held itself together. I enjoyed the characters and I enjoyed the plot line of the thriller-esque part of it, and I enjoyed certain ideas that the book was playing around with, but for me, the actual like underlying time travel concept of the ability to go back and constantly be rewriting history just didn't work. It created a world that I couldn't buy in or believe would actually be able to possibly happen, and there are certain aspects where if you're out of the timeline in question and you're in a different timeline and then something happens and then you come back to your modern day, you have the ability to remember how things were. Like the way that things get overwritten in people's brains as to what is and isn't kind of known collective history is something that I just don't think this book ever really fully had a handle on and didn't do very well. Time travel is so hard to do in a book, and I think that they work best when you really put strict limitations on what you can do in time travel, whether it be the direction you can go, the time frame you can work in, with the determinism argument as to whether you can change things or not, how many people can time travel, and this book was just real free and easy with all of it, and in doing so I think ran into a lot of problems. If you enjoy sci-fi and you don't mind the fact that it doesn't quite work as a world building thing, I do think that this is a fun book that is doing a lot of entertaining, interesting things, and I enjoyed the characters and the general kind of rough plot and also kind of setting and stuff. But for me personally, I couldn't get over this like huge glaring plot hole problem of the fact that the entire system didn't work for me, and that was just something that really got in the way. So it really depends on like why you're coming to sci-fi, so whether you think you'll enjoy this book or not. The next book I read is Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly, and this is the untold story of the African American women who helped win the space race. This has been made into a movie that was quite popular. I have seen the movie, I really enjoyed it, apart from the scene about the white savior complex. We'll ignore that for now. But generally this book is what the movie was based off of, but this book does a lot more than what the movie does because it just has a lot more space. So like the subtitle suggests, it is looking at the African American women who worked within NASA as mathematicians and computers to help to get kind of America winning the space race, but it also is doing a lot more than that. So whilst the book is somewhat focused on NASA, it actually starts a lot earlier, towards the beginning of the Second World War, and why the advancements that were needed in aviation ended up basically paving the way for both civil rights and women's rights being able to be in more places of work, that then allowed these African American women to be in the right place at the right time for NASA to happen. As well as it talks about a couple of very particular women who the movie then does focus on, about their life, their biographies, their work, but it also is doing a very kind of general macro sense of what was happening in the political and social climate of America at the time, both from the Second World War, but also why was NASA a thing? Why did we suddenly, by we I mean America, I'm in the UK, why did America and Russia desperately pour so much money into the space race, and kind of what was going on there. So it's kind of a general macro history as well as a biography of these three different women. I really enjoyed this book. It was a little overwritten in a few places, which just means stylistically it kind of takes a few pages to get used to, but once you're into Margot Lee Shetterly's particular writing style, I deeply enjoyed it and thought that it was just hugely informative on so many different areas. It also really reinforced the idea that actually when I'm interested in things like World War II, I'm actually more interested in the social stuff, so it's sparked me going off to find more books that look really interesting. Okay, I have 4 books to talk about left to talk about now, and these are all ones that I read for Becca's Bookopoly-thon, the 48-hour readathon that happened. There were a whole bunch of different prompts and different things going on. I technically did complete the readathon if you just needed to read 4 prompts in total, so I did do that. So yeah, we're gonna talk about all that. First one I finished is Ayesha at Last by Jalaluddin. This is a Pride and Prejudice retelling, but reframed with a full Muslim cast. It's a contemporary romance that I generally really enjoyed. I thought that it was highly entertaining and really sweet and really good fun. I've not actually read Pride and Prejudice. I've seen several different movie adaptations and I know loosely the storyline, but it's just an Austen that I haven't quite got round to yet. One thing I really enjoyed was I thought that the character growth for both of the main characters was really fun and interesting to watch. Like with some contemporary romance, there were a few moments and scenes which were sort of felt very like, this is not a natural behaviour that someone would do in terms of like confused identities or pretending to do something else. However, it's kind of necessary for the plot, and I honestly can't remember if any of those, like with a retelling, part of the problem is you are locked into the plot points of the actual original, and I can't actually remember if there is like a mistaken identity thing in Pride and Prejudice or not. Generally, I had a really good time. I really enjoyed it. I thought that there were some interesting discussions about being a Muslim in, I believe it's set in Canada, but being Muslim in a non-Muslim country, and also kind of what is expected from the concept of like an arranged marriage and the different ways of understanding that depending on what culture you're coming from. Both the main characters, like I said, went through a really lovely moment of kind of character growth and character arc, and just generally I had a good time. I thought that it was lovely and light-hearted and really fun. So if you're a fan of contemporary romance in general, I would 100% recommend this. It was great. The next book I read was Trouble with Lykan by John Wyndham. This is the fourth John Wyndham book I've now read this year. This one is one of his lesser known ones. John Wyndham was a sci-fi writer writing in the 50s, I want to say. I think I do this every time. This was published in 1960. I was pretty close for once. This one in particular is about 2 scientists who discover an anti-aging to the degree of potentially immortality property to some lichen, and there are 2 different ways of approaching what should be done with this information, and it sort of sparks from there. In terms of as a sci-fi book, I think it actually suffers from the passage of time that a lot of the things that were discussed in this book no longer seem particularly sci-fi. One of the things I think John Wyndham does amazingly as a writer is his ability to predict what human beings would, like how human beings would react to certain ideas and certain things, is so bang on that even like now 60 years later, we probably would react in the same way. But that's a double-edged sword, because it means if you are looking for like strict sci-fi, if the ideas that he's coming up with are now no longer particularly kind of controversial or crazy and outlandish, it actually kind of read more like a contemporary, just with some funky new age drug out there. So that was interesting as a reading experience. So it's probably been my least favourite of the Wyndhams I've read so far, but that's like saying that this is my like least favourite chocolate bar. It still means that it was a bloody good read, and I really, really deeply enjoyed it. What was also interesting as well is one of the scientists is a woman, and she's very determined to use the anti-aging properties to basically spark a feminist revolution, because if women are no longer watching the clock for when they can do certain things in their life, like have a family, then actually the options for a career become a lot more important and poignant to you. And given that he was writing at, you know, in 1960, I thought that this was genuinely a very interesting discussion that John Wyndham, as a male author writing, did very, very well, and I was very impressed with that. The thing I really wanted though was, this is quite a short book, and I just felt like he was really getting to the meat of the conversation just as the book came to an end, which is something I've kind of felt with a few of his books before. And I could almost see this idea, this kind of sort of seed that he sowed here, then being picked up with works that you have out there like The Power or Vox or The XX or other kind of very like feminist fiction texts that are working on speculative fiction out there. You can see almost roots going all the way back to this. So I thought it was really fascinating seeing a male author from that particular time period doing so well with what I would consider to be quite a modern topic. The next book I finished is The Tombs of Ataran by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is book 2 in the Earthsea series, and I had a good time. Like, I was a bit on the fence with Earthsea. I wasn't overly bothered by book 1, but I really enjoyed book 2. Book 2 focuses on a kind of sect or cult who worship the unknown, which is kind of riffing off of ideas of like the dead, or like sort of demons and kind of the badness in the world. And it is about a young girl who is sort of playing almost like a sacrificial role within this, and then it's about our main character from the overarching series, Ged, coming to that island to try and find a particular artifact, and his interactions with her. It was riffing off of some ideas on almost like Thebes and Labyrinth and the monster in the dark kind of stuff. I really enjoyed just sort of generally what the book was doing. What I also really liked about it was, I had a bit of a complaint about book 1 that there were like no female characters that didn't basically fulfill really, really awful misogynistic roles that were very much like props for the men. So the fact that the bulk of this book is dedicated to women and has the lead character being a woman was really, or like a young girl, was really something that I appreciated, and I was pleased that Ursula K. Le Guin had like dealt with at some point. So yeah, generally it's meant that I am far more likely to continue with the series, and I think the kind of discussions of the different religions in that world was also really interesting. And then the final book I have to talk about is actually a graphic novel, a non-fiction graphic novel, and that is Sensible Footwear, A Girl's Guide by Kate Charlesworth. I do that every time I say her name and I say Chate. This is a combination of a history of the LGBTQ community plus a memoir of Kate, spanning like her entire life. Generally I thought that it was really entertaining, enjoyable, engaging, deeply informative. The only real issue I had with this was occasionally it would be difficult to understand the narrative flow, whether it be for Kate's life or to make sure I had all the information in like the chronological order that I wanted for the history of the queer community, because ease of access to information was kind of sacrificed for aesthetics within the spreads. So I'll kind of show you what I mean. I'll see if I can find one. But kind of scenes, pages like this, there are sort of bits where it is sometimes hard to track exactly what is going on, and I would quite often end up missing bits of information, or sometimes like she wasn't very consistent with whether you went kind of along one page and then along the next, or whether you were sort of reading across, and I definitely think I just kind of struggled a little bit with grabbing certain parts of it. However, if you are slightly more familiar with the graphic novel format, it has been a long time since I read any graphic novels, maybe I was missing some obvious visual cues, or indeed just like if you're willing to take your time with it. It was deeply interesting and informative. I had a really good time, and basically I think non-fiction graphic novels are something that I need to explore a little bit more. It's an interesting way of imparting that information. So generally that's it from me. It's been a really strong start to the reading month, but I have tailed off a little bit recently. I've been not so much avoiding reading, but focusing my energies on things like some podcasts, some other hobbies, and some... Basically, I've been watching Avatar: The Last Airbender for the first time, and it's really great. So my reading has slowed down a bit, but I'm sure it'll pick up towards the end of the month, and I'll have plenty to talk to you about. That is it from me. Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye!